Thank you very much, Thomas. Thank you, Laura, also for the very kind invitation. I'm very happy to be here and to discuss about connectivity in epilepsy, which is, I think, a very important concept in this pathology. Epilepsy is a disease of network, of abnormal hypersynchronous networks, as we will discuss. So this is a devastating disease. Approximately 50 million people have epilepsy. It's one of the most common neurological diseases. It's characterized by recurrent seizures. This is what is most spectacular in epilepsy, but of course you have pathological activity all the time. We will discuss that also. And in 1/3 of the patients, medication cannot suppress seizures, so surgery can be considered where a part of the brain has to be removed to prevent seizures from occurring. So the goal of pre-surgical evaluation is to define precisely the part of the brain that needs to be removed, so the so-called epileptogenic zone. And the first phase of that is to do as many non-invasive measures as possible to try to have a clear idea of the possible brain regions which are responsible for the seizures. And this can include electrophysiology, imaging, long-term video recordings, all kinds of also nuclear imaging. And if there are clear hypotheses on the regions that are affected, then the medical doctors can decide to put electrodes within the brain. So Bin has presented before electrocorticography, where you have a grid placed on the brain. And what we do in Marseille is stereotaxic EEG, SEEG, which is actually electrodes going directly within the brain. So we have from 10 to 15 electrodes that target a discrete part of the brain, and each electrode has from 5 to 15 contacts. The hallmark of epilepsy is, of course, the epileptic seizure, and one classical marker of the seizure is the fast discharge, the low voltage fast discharge. So it's a flattening of the signals. This is intracerebral EEG, and an increase in the high frequency content. Not all seizure will start this way, but it's the most common pattern. Between seizures, you have the interictal state, which correspond also to pathological brain networks. And what we've been studying for a long time are the interictal spikes, so these sharp transient events occurring frequently in the traces of the patient. And there is more and more interest in high-frequency oscillations, and it has been shown that you can have pathological oscillations up to 500 Hertz in epilepsy, and that they actually constitute a good marker of the epileptogenic tissue. So it's still an area of very active research. So why should we study networks with electrophysiology? Of course, as has been mentioned by Thomas and other people this morning, electrophysiology has the temporal dimension that can track the very fine propagation and very fast propagation occurring in epilepsy at the millisecond time scale. Very large networks can be involved early in the seizure, so it's somehow difficult to set a line, to put a distinction between the tissue that needs to be resected and the tissue that can be preserved, because activity propagates extremely fast. So people have designed local measures in every point of the brain. They could do some measure of epileptogenicity. And connectivity, recently, it has become a very active research because it's a promising venue as a biomarker of the tissues that need to be resected, of the pathological tissues, and as we will discuss, based on graph measures. So I will start by intracerebral recordings. So as I said, it's stereotaxic EEG, SEEG recordings. There have been several studies on defining a signal processing measure to define the epileptogenicity of a given tissue. Most of them are based on the increase in a high frequency content of the signal, so occurring during this seizure onset, this fast discharge, you have this increase of high frequency activity. And also the timing is important. As I said, things propagate very fast, so you have to take into account both the increase of frequency and the timing. And you can, this way, define nodes of the network that are pathological, but without connectivity measure. It's really local measures. Now I'll switch to connectivity, as this is the main topic here. And historically, the measures that have been used are coherence. So Jean Gottman did pioneering studies in using coherence for measuring epileptic networks. And he also introduced the measure of timing. And sometimes we hear that coherence is not good for timing. And actually, you have the delay information, but it's a bit hidden in the phase. And something that has been used a lot by the collaboration between Marseille and Rennes is the 8-square index, the nonlinear correlation, which was introduced by Pine and Lopez da Silva. And this gives also a very interesting results. And more recently, all the measures that were presented this morning, like Granger causality, phase locking index, have been used increasingly. So now, if you do your favorite graph measure, you end up very fast with a very complex movie of graphs. So let's say here we have a sliding window of 2 seconds that we go along in interictal state, ictal state, and this is really overwhelming. You will be you have too much information there. So one way to reduce complexity and to have simple local measures is to use graph measures. So the simplest graph measure are the degrees of the graph. So you just count the number of arrows, very simply, that goes out of a given region. This is the out degrees, or that come inside a region, the in degrees. You can also use the strength, which is the sum of values. So the degrees are on binary graph, and the strength on values, continuous values between 0 and 1. So the little trouble we have with connectivity in epilepsy is that the seizure start is actually a period of desynchrony. So you lower the connectivity. So it's a bit unexpected, but this is it. That's the true, the sad story of the true life of looking at real signals. And so all this period is not really usable in the connectivity measures. Maybe we will find out ways, but it's easier to go inside the seizure, where you have actually a very high connectivity values. You see here the profile of connectivity across time. So during the start of the seizure, you have this abrupt drop. Right after, you have a very large increase in synchrony. And also the pre-ictal period, the period just before the seizure, has quite a high level of connectivity also. So we will aim at this period, or this one, or even further away in the interictal period to do connectivity studies. This is a study by the Geneva group, this is the Belgium group, Peter van Mierlo, who's done a very interesting work on connectivity, Granger causality during the seizure, so with this idea of a continuous movie of connectivity. And it was summarized here, because as I said, one needs to summarize, across all time windows and across all connections, with the out degrees during the seizures. And they found that you get very important clinical information from this summarized measure. So it's really within the seizure. It means that also during the seizure, the regions that are more important in the network are still leaders in the network. They keep to be very active. This is a study from our group where we studied the period immediately before the fast discharge, so the pre-ictal period. We did a connectivity analysis with a nonlinear correlation right before the seizure start to see if the networks were getting involved into epileptic activity. And we also used the degrees. We computed out degrees and in degrees. And what we found is that in a specific frequency band, you have networks that are really corresponding to the seizure start. So this is the epileptogenicity index. It's a local measure that defines the fast discharge. And this is the out strength measure from the connectivity graph. And you see in the high frequency band between 15 and 40 hertz that you will retrieve very nicely the regions that are involved in the seizure starts. So that means the dynamic the dynamic of the network is already taking place before the seizure. And it also means that when you have this very low frequency activity, which are very typical of epileptic discharges, they are not very localizing. They are very diffuse, so you have these large-scale slow networks, and it's really the fast part of it, so the actual epileptic spike, which gives the localizing value. So a lot of work has been done by the group of Fabrice Wendling in Rennes on interictal networks, and they found out a very nice way to characterize the networks, which looks like action potential studies. So they looked at the co-occurrence of epileptic spikes across regions. So this is again intracerebral data. And based on this co-occurrence matrix, they would find subgroups of regions that talk to one another. So here you have no Granger causality, no correlation, just the timing, the probability of occurrence of events is already giving a lot of information on the actual network. So once we've seen the networks in the depth, so in intracerebral EEG, of course we may want to go to the surface and see how we can recover this non-invasively and maybe avoid putting electrodes in the brain. So this is the Geneva study from Anna Coito, who did so source localization on epileptic activity. And it's a group study with right epilepsy patients and left epilepsy patients. And she did the weighted partial directed coherence and displayed the node outflow. So again, the same idea of measuring the inflow and outflow of every node in the brain. And she found very interestingly that you have common patterns to the patients depending on the localization of epilepsy. This has been done also by the group in Rennes, the group of Fabrice Wendling, who has done a recent study to validate this kind of approach based on intracerebral EEG. So you can compare the surface measures to the actual intracerebral traces, and also to simulated data. So it's a group which is very strong in making simulations of epileptic networks. So it's another way to provide a gold standard. Maybe it's probably the only way to provide a gold standard is to have a very realistic simulation. So I'm going to switch to MEG, and Christophe is not there. Usually we have fun fighting between MEG and EEG. So I wanted to have a peace message here that they are both complementary. We shouldn't oppose them. And this is an example I like to show for sleep spindles, so nothing to do with epilepsy. And you can see in this study that some sleep spindles are visible in both MEG, so this is the MEG part, and EEG. And some are only visible in EEG, and other ones only in MEG. So that means that it's really by putting them together that you can hope to really extract the complete dynamic of the networks. So probably the best way would be to go to combine fusion methods, as was proposed by several groups. So this is a study by the group of Bnar, one of the pioneers of connectivity in epilepsy on non-invasive and invasive data. And this is a very nice comparison with a resected area, because of course we want to see if what we measure has an impact on the surgical results. So in this study, they compared the surgical results and the actual localization and found out that you can extract a lot of information from the surface. So several other studies have looked at this from the MEG perspective. A recent study also has shown that you don't actually don't need to see the epileptic spikes, because traditionally we would mark spikes on the signals. But even if you don't see anything, just by studying the resting state connectivity patterns, you can already extract a lot of information and clinically relevant information. So the network, even if it doesn't produce visible spike, is already in a pathological mode that you can retrieve non-invasively. We have proposed to use ICA, and this was presented by Scott this morning. So we've went along this path, and we think it's a very interesting method. So independent component analysis, as was shown by Scott, allows decomposing the MEG signals into components. So each component has a time course and a spatial topography. And you can look, in the context of epilepsy, you can look whether you see epileptic discharge on a component and whether it has a topography which suggests a neuronal source, a brain source. So when we see a nice dipolar topography like that and epileptic spikes, we can safely say that this is an epileptic component. So once we've seen the epileptic components, we've selected them, we can do as was done in intracerebral EEG. We can use the same method to find the co-occurrence matrix between events. So if events co-occur across different components, we can say that these components are connected, and we can build a connectivity graph based on co-occurrence with the arrow defined by the timing, different timing between events. Typically, the topographies are very dipolar, are very simple because they have been unmixed by the ICA, so we can fit dipoles on that. And on more complex topographies, we're currently working on other methods, but most of the time, a simple dipole works very well. So this is the kind of graph we can obtain from the MEG signals. This is the location of the different dipoles corresponding to the ICA components, and the connectivity graph based on co-occurrence of spikes. And this is the graph actually obtained from intracerebral EEG, so directly within the brain. And we see in this case that we have a very good match between the leader of the network seen from MEG and the leader actually measured intracerebrally. Of course, SEG has a much higher sensitivity. We see more with SEG, but the clinically relevant information was found, and also the general pattern of propagation from anterior to posterior was well retrieved in the MEG. Now, I could stop here and say that everything is wonderful and works well, but of course there are cases that don't work, or at least not as well. I think it's important also to show that in this case, for example, the MEG leader, so the node where all arrows were going out, was confirmed by SEG. So it's actually a node of the epileptic network found intracerebrally, but it's not the leader node. So the leader node is hidden here. It's not visible, at least with our method. We have a sensitivity issue. So we really have to understand when we can see something from the depth and when we cannot see it. So these results were done on separate recordings, an MEG session and an intracerebral EEG session, but we think this is a big limitation to be on separate recordings because they don't record the exact same activity, and we know activity fluctuates in time, for example, with the level of medication, the state of the subject. And also separate recordings, they don't allow using ongoing single trial fluctuations as a source of information. This was done, for example, in simultaneous EEG fMRI. So you get more information from the simultaneous recordings also. So the next step, of course, is to record MEG and intracerebral EEG together. So this has been done by several groups. And what we did was actually to record the three modalities together, EEG, MEG, and intracerebral, which is somehow challenging, but well, one needs challenges once in a while. And this is an example on visual evoked activity. So this is all the trials of the visual stimulation on intracerebral, on EEG, and on MEG at the same time. And you see the visual evoked potential is very well retrieved by the three modalities. Since then, we've improved the setup. So in particular, we worked on the size of the fixation of SEG. So this is all the intracerebral EEG equipment. You can see you have bolts that go out of the skull. So you cannot really put the head in the MEG helmet if the head is too big. So we worked on smaller fixations. And we worked also on the amplifier, which is a key point in the recording chain. So this is an example of the recent data we have. So this is intracerebral EEG and magnetoencephalography. You can see that if you have very small discharges, so very local discharges, you cannot see them visually on the traces. And if you have a large network which is involved, so you can see here the nodes or the electrodes are shown in color, so the green and the red here. So it's a very widespread network involving distant regions. So once this big network is active, then you see a spike at the surface. So all the goal here is to see in which condition you can see something at the surface, and also to validate the signal processing method to try to increase sensitivity. So it's what Pedro mentioned this morning. We need a ground truth. So this is a ground truth to which non-invasive modalities can be compared. Another interesting aspect of this is that it can expand the SEG view. You can have a local view with SEG and a global view with MEG. So we marked spikes using the sensitivity of intracerebral EEG, and we averaged the data at the surface, and we performed source localization there. And we could find that we had sources remote from the intracerebral electrode. So that means that probably an electrode should have been put there, and this can indicate that there is something, there's some trouble here, some pitfall. So other pitfalls. Of course, you have the source leakage issue that's been mentioned. If when you do the inverse problem, you will have very large correlation patterns coming from the inverse problem kernel matrix. And actually, ICA, I think, is one way of getting rid of this source leakage. It has probably other disadvantage, but it has the clear advantage of taking everything which is perfectly correlated and putting it into one component. So all the leakage will be kind of absorbed by the components. Something also we want to emphasize is that there is, as soon as you study epileptic data, you have epileptic spikes which are very sharp. So if you simply filter the data to get the classical bands, as we do always do, like alpha band, gamma, and so on, you will have ringing of the filter just coming from these sharp transients. So this will produce seemingly epileptic oscillations, but it's just the response, the impulse response of the filter. So it's trivial, but it's sometimes been overlooked. So we think that a good way to study that is time frequency analysis. So two ways maybe to get rid of these issues. One is to remove the spike. It's a tricky thing, but we've tried methods to despike the data so that when you actually filter the data, you filter the real oscillatory part, not the transient part which produces high frequencies. And also the time frequency representation is very useful to find isolated blobs of activity. And this is a work where we've whitened the spectrum. So we balanced energy across all frequencies to be able to see clearly the high frequency activity. And also in the reconstructed traces, you can see that all of a sudden very subtle high frequency oscillation become obvious. So one has really to be aware of these problems. Even in regular EEG, you can have transient artifacts, but it's even more problematic in epilepsy, where you have the epileptic spikes, which have very sharp transitions. So as a conclusion, I think we can safely say now that connectivity is a new marker in EEG, MEG, and intracerebral analysis. The surface recordings and results are being confirmed by intracerebral recordings, and so this is a great ground truth. And some new venues are to go on doing simultaneous recordings for characterizing the sensitivity of MEG-EEG, also for designing the best signal processing methods. Maybe also work on the joint analysis of this. So as we have this local and this global view, we might as well study them together instead of confronting them separately. And another very interesting venue is computational modeling that will enable us to better understand the signal generation and maybe also to estimate parameters. So it's a bit the idea of the DCM that was presented by Daniele. You can estimate hidden parameters from the observed signals, and this has been done in a virtual brain framework by the team of Victor Gilsa recently to estimate the excitability of the tissues from the model. And this is an example of a comparison of depth and surface results. So this is the ICA time course retrieved from MEG, and this is the actual intracerebral EEG, and we see in this case we have quite an amazing match. So thank you very much for your attention. I think I was fast. Should we keep the questions for the end, or as you want?
Thank you, Christian. If there are brief questions, we can maybe take them now, or we can also have a discussion at the end, and you can also address things later.